Standing in front of the mirror on my wedding day, I thought I knew who I was and where my life was headed. But one unexpected challenge would awaken a long-buried dream and set me on a path I never imagined. A journey of courage, passion, and the discovery of my true voice. The sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting a golden glow over the room as I adjusted my wedding dress for what felt like the 100th time. My heart was pounding, a mix of joy and nerves coursing through me. Today, I would become Mrs. Isabelle Fernandez. "You look beautiful, darling," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion as she stepped into the room. She carefully placed the veil over my hair, smoothing it gently. "Carlos is a lucky man." I smiled, but my anxiety simmered just below the surface. "Thank you, Mom. I just hope everything goes well today." She held my hands, looking straight into my eyes. "Isabelle, don't let Dolores spoil your happiness. This is your day." Dolores, my soon-to-be mother-in-law. The thought of her made my stomach churn. From the moment Carlos introduced me to his parents, Dolores had made her disapproval clear. To her, I was just a simple schoolteacher, neither refined nor cultured enough for her precious son. "I'll try, Mom," I said, forcing a confident tone. But deep down I knew it wouldn't be easy. Dolores had a way of turning even the happiest occasions into a battlefield of subtle jabs and criticisms. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Sophia, my best friend and maid of honor, her excitement practically radiating from her. "The limo is here," she exclaimed. "Are you ready?" Her enthusiasm was infectious, momentarily pushing my worries aside. "Let's do this," I said, smiling. The ride to the winery was a whirlwind of emotions. I gazed out at the Catalan countryside, trying to focus on the beauty of the day instead of the knot in my stomach. Sophia squeezed my hand. "Carlos chose well," she said, referring to the stunning estate where the ceremony would take place. "It's magical." I nodded, the memory of our first visit to the winery bringing a small smile to my lips. "Do you remember the time I nearly knocked over an entire row of wine bottles?" Sophia burst out laughing. "How could I forget? You were so nervous. But look at you now. You're about to marry the love of your life." Her words gave me a small boost of confidence, but as the limo pulled into the cypress-lined driveway, reality hit me. Guests were already arriving, and the sight of the bustling estate filled me with both excitement and apprehension. "Take a deep breath, Isabelle," my mother said, squeezing my hand. "Everything is going to be all right." I nodded, though I couldn't quite shake the nervous energy coursing through me. Stepping out of the car, my attention was immediately drawn to a familiar figure near the main entrance. Dolores. Even from a distance, I could feel her disapproval. She wore a dark purple dress that seemed to absorb the sunlight, her expression a mix of forced politeness and barely concealed judgment. "Don't let her get to you," Sophia murmured, guiding me toward the small building where I would wait before the ceremony. "This day is about you and Carlos. Focus on that." I tried to take her advice, but Dolores' presence lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. Still, as the hours passed in a blur of last-minute preparations, photographs, and well-wishes, I allowed myself to get swept up in the magic of the day. Finally, the moment came. The music swelled, the chapel doors opened, and my father took my arm. My heart raced as we began the long walk down the aisle. I barely noticed the guests watching me. My eyes searched for one face, Carlos. And there he was, standing at the altar, his gaze locked on mine. He looked radiant, his love for me written all over his face. In that moment, everything else faded away. Dolores, her criticisms, and all my fears melted into the background. All that mattered was the man waiting for me at the end of the aisle. The ceremony was a dream. We exchanged vows, slipped rings onto each other's fingers, and sealed our union with a kiss. Applause and cheers filled the chapel as we walked out hand in hand, rose petals raining down on us. For a brief moment, I felt invincible, like nothing could ruin this day. But as my eyes met Dolores' cold, unreadable gaze, I knew the peace wouldn't last. The real test was yet to come. The reception was a dazzling affair set in the estate's lush gardens. White tents draped in soft lights and flowers framed the tables, and the air buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. Carlos stayed by my side, his hand firmly intertwined with mine, as we greeted guests and accepted their congratulations. For a while, I allowed myself to bask in the joy of the day, letting the warmth of friends and family distract me from the unease that Dolores' presence stirred. "You're the most beautiful bride in the world," Carlos whispered, leaning close to kiss my cheek. "And you're the most wonderful husband," I replied, my heart swelling with love. But even amid the celebration, I couldn't ignore the occasional sharp glances Dolores sent my way from across the garden. She sat at a table, sipping her wine and chatting with a few guests, but her calculating expression made it clear she was still scheming. I braced myself, knowing it was only a matter of time before she made her move. Dinner was served, a feast of Catalan specialties paired with the estate's finest wines. The atmosphere was cheerful, and for a brief time, I started to believe that maybe the day would end without incident. But then Dolores stood, her glass raised, and the hum of conversation died down. "Dear friends, dear family," she began, her voice carrying easily over the crowd. "We are here today to celebrate the union of my son Carlos and his lovely new wife, Isabelle." My chest tightened as I felt Carlos' hand tense in mine. He squeezed it gently, his silent way of telling me to stay calm. Dolores continued, her smile pleasant but her eyes glinting with something sharper. "As tradition dictates, I'd like to propose a toast to the happy couple. But first I have a small request." Her gaze turned to me, and the air seemed to grow heavier. "Isabelle," she said sweetly, "I've heard that you have a lovely voice. Won't you do us the honor of singing something to celebrate your love for my son?" My heart stopped. The challenge was clear. Dolores wasn't asking for a heartfelt performance. She was setting a trap. She wanted to embarrass me, to prove to everyone that I wasn't worthy of Carlos or the family I had married into. Carlos interjected immediately, his voice strained. "Mother, this really isn't necessary. Isabelle doesn't need to." Dolores cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, come now, Carlos. Just a song. I'm sure your wife won't refuse unless of course she can't." I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. The weight of their expectations was suffocating, and my chest tightened as panic threatened to overwhelm me. But then I caught Carlos' gaze. His eyes were filled with love and reassurance, silently telling me that I could do this, no matter what Dolores hoped to achieve. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. "Of course, Dolores," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "I would be delighted to sing." Dolores' smug smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of surprise. She clearly hadn't expected me to accept her challenge. "What song would you like me to sing?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside me. Dolores' lips curled into a sweet but venomous smile. "Oh, I'll leave that up to you, my dear. Something from the heart, perhaps." I nodded, turning to the crowd. "Friends and family, I'd like to sing a song that has special meaning to Carlos and me. It's a traditional Catalan piece, one that speaks of love and hope." Closing my eyes, I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had. The first notes of El Cant dels Ocells slipped from my lips, soft and tentative, but they quickly grew stronger. The melody soared through the air, my voice carrying the emotion I felt for Carlos, for this moment, and for the love that had brought us here. I poured everything into the song, letting my passion and training guide me. When I reached the chorus, I opened my eyes and saw the faces around me. Guests who had started with polite curiosity now looked captivated. Some had tears glistening in their eyes, and even Dolores seemed momentarily stunned. Carlos' expression was what kept me going. His eyes were filled with pride and adoration, his love for me radiating with every note I sang. As I held the final note, the garden fell into a hushed silence. For a moment, no one moved, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Then, thunderous applause erupted. Guests stood, cheering and clapping, some wiping tears from their cheeks. Carlos was the first to reach me, wrapping me in his arms. "That was beautiful," he whispered. "You're amazing." I smiled, overwhelmed with relief and pride. The applause continued, but my attention was drawn to Dolores. She sat with her champagne glass in hand, her expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of respect in her eyes before she masked it with her usual composed demeanor. "Well, my dear," she said as she approached us. "That was unexpected. You've surprised us all tonight." Her words were carefully chosen, but I didn't miss the reluctant hint of admiration buried within them. "Thank you, Dolores," I replied, meeting her gaze evenly. "Music has always been a part of who I am." Dolores raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, retreating into the crowd. Carlos pulled me close, his smile beaming with pride. "You were incredible, Isabelle," he said softly. "I knew you could do it." In that moment, I realized that Dolores' attempt to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. Instead of proving my inadequacy, she had given me the opportunity to reveal a part of myself I had kept hidden for too long. As the evening wore on, guests continued to shower me with compliments and questions about my performance. And for the first time in a long time I felt proud, not just of my voice, but of my courage to stand tall in the face of doubt. The challenge meant to tear me down had become a triumph, and I knew in my heart that it was only the beginning. The weeks following the wedding were a whirlwind of bliss and reflection. Carlos and I spent our honeymoon on the Amalfi Coast, basking in the warmth of the Italian sun and the joy of being newlyweds. Yet, even in the middle of paradise, my thoughts often drifted back to that moment at the wedding reception. The song, the applause, and Dolores' reaction. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of our hotel room, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean, Carlos took my hand in his. "You've been quiet, my love," he said gently. "What's on your mind?" I sighed, turning to him. "I keep thinking about the wedding reception. About my song. About your mother." Carlos nodded, his gaze soft but knowing. "She wasn't expecting you to shine like that, Isabelle. You caught her off guard." I hesitated, the words forming carefully in my mind. "I wonder if I should have told you the truth about my past earlier, about the conservatory, my training. Maybe if I had, things would have been easier." Carlos smiled, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "Isabelle, you don't owe anyone an explanation. You wanted to be loved for who you are, not for your talent or your past. And I love you exactly as you are." His words comforted me, but they couldn't quiet the restless thoughts stirring inside. Singing at the reception had awakened something in me, a passion I thought I had left behind. That night, lying in bed, I found myself humming softly, the melody of El Cant dels Ocells drifting into the stillness. Carlos stirred beside me, listening, and when I stopped, he whispered, "Don't ever let that voice stay hidden again." When we returned to Barcelona, life resumed its rhythm, though something felt different. Carlos and I moved into our new apartment, unpacking our lives and settling into our routine. But as I stood in the kitchen one afternoon preparing dinner, the phone rang, a number I recognized instantly. "Dolores." Carlos entered the room as I stared at the phone, hesitating to answer. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to talk to her if you're not ready." I shook my head. "No, it's time." I answered the call, my voice steady despite the nerves tightening my chest. "Isabelle," Dolores said, her tone unusually soft. "I hope you're settling in well. I was calling to invite you both to dinner tonight." There it was, the moment I had been anticipating. Dolores had undoubtedly called for more than a friendly meal. "We'd love to," I replied, determined not to shy away from whatever she had planned. That evening, as we stood outside the imposing Fernandez family home, my heart raced. Carlos squeezed my hand. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes," I said, nodding firmly. "It's time to stop hiding." Dolores greeted us at the door, her usual air of control evident in her perfectly composed smile. She led us to the dining room, where Antonio, her husband, greeted us warmly. Dinner began with polite conversation, Antonio eagerly asking about our honeymoon while Dolores observed me with her sharp, calculating gaze. It wasn't long before she steered the conversation to the topic I knew was coming. "Isabelle," she said smoothly, setting down her glass, "your performance at the wedding was quite the surprise. I had no idea you were so musically inclined." I felt Carlos stiffen beside me, but I placed my hand over his to calm him. This was my moment to be honest, no matter how Dolores reacted. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice steady. "I haven't been entirely open about my past. The truth is, I studied at the Conservatory Superior de Música in Barcelona. I graduated a few years ago after years of rigorous training." Antonio's eyes widened in surprise, his face breaking into an impressed smile. "The Liceu Conservatory. That's incredible, Isabelle. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" I glanced at Dolores, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "Because I was afraid of being judged," I admitted. "I didn't pursue a professional career in music. Instead, I chose to become a teacher. It's a decision I made because I wanted to use my passion for music to inspire children, just as my teachers inspired me." Antonio nodded, clearly moved by my explanation. But Dolores leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Teaching is noble," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "But don't you think giving up a career in music was a waste of your talent?" Carlos opened his mouth to protest, but I spoke before he could. "No, Dolores," I said firmly. "It wasn't a waste. It was my choice and it brings me joy. I still sing. I still perform. But I do it on my terms, without the pressures of a professional career. Teaching allows me to share my love of music with the next generation." The silence that followed was heavy, but I held Dolores' gaze, refusing to waver. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "I see," she said slowly, her voice lacking its usual edge. "I suppose I misjudged you, Isabelle. It seems there's more to you than I realized." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I'd ever get. As we left that night, Carlos wrapped his arm around me. "You were incredible, Isabelle. I've never been prouder of you." I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time I felt truly seen, not just by Dolores but by myself. The song I had sung at our wedding had been the beginning, but this moment was the turning point. I had faced my fear and reclaimed a part of myself that I had kept hidden for too long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never let my voice be silenced again. My cheeks flushed. "I didn't realize I was loud enough for anyone to hear," I said, embarrassed. Javier smiled warmly. "You weren't loud, but your voice is extraordinary. It has a depth and emotion that can't be taught. If you're interested, I'd love to hear more and possibly work with you." He handed me a business card, his sincerity catching me off guard. "Think about it," he said, nodding politely before walking away. Sophia leaned across the table, her eyes wide with excitement. "Isabelle, this is a sign. You have to call him." I stared at the card, my heart racing. The idea of pursuing music professionally again both thrilled and terrified me. That night, I shared the encounter with Carlos, unsure of how he'd react. He listened intently, then took my hands in his. "Isabelle," he said softly, "I love you for who you are, not what you do. But if singing again makes you happy, I'll support you every step of the way." His unwavering faith in me brought tears to my eyes. "I'm scared, Carlos. What if I fail?" He smiled. "Then we'll face it together. You don't have to do this alone." A week later, I stood in a small rehearsal studio, my hands trembling as Javier gestured for me to begin. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the music flow. The moment I started to sing, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The notes poured out of me, each one carrying my heart and soul. When I finished, Javier stood and clapped. "You're incredible," he said. "I want to work with you. Let's make something beautiful together." Months later, as I stepped onto the stage at the Palau de la Música Catalana for my first solo concert, I looked out at the audience. Carlos was there, his smile radiating pride. My parents, Sofia, and even Dolores were in attendance. As the orchestra began to play and I sang the opening notes, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Dolores' challenge on my wedding day had set me on a path I never thought I'd walk again, a path toward embracing my true self and my long-buried dream. The applause at the end of my performance was deafening, but what mattered most was the joy and love I felt in my heart. For the first time, I wasn't just singing. I was soaring. Life, I realized, had a way of guiding us toward where we were meant to be. And at that moment, under the bright lights of the stage, I knew I was exactly where I belonged.